I'm Michael James. I'm 35 years old, and my own parents and brothers manipulated me into giving them my credit card, then laughed in my face when they left me with only $10. But before I tell you about the look on their faces when they realized the card they maxed out was actually their own, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can reach. It all started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. My phone buzzed, and the caller ID flashed Mom. A familiar knot of anxiety, cold and hard like a stone, settled in my stomach. We hadn't spoken in months, not since I finally gathered the strength to draw a line in the sand after a lifetime of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. But seeing her name, a foolish, stubborn part of you, the little kid part that never really goes away, always whispers a dangerous question. Maybe this time it'll be different. It wasn't. Michael, thank God you picked up. Isabella's voice was a carefully crafted performance of strain and panic. I could picture her perfectly, sitting in her pristine white kitchen, one hand touching her pearl necklace, the picture of manufactured crisis. We have an emergency, a real emergency. I stayed silent, a tactic I'd learned late in life. Don't offer anything. Let them reveal themselves. It's your father, she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's an online payment for a new piece of medical equipment, a supplier from Germany. Our bank, for some ridiculous reason, flagged our cards for international fraud protection. Can you believe the incompetence? We have to get this payment through in the next hour, or he loses the deposit. It's $5,000, honey. The details were meant to sound plausible, urgent, but I could feel the lie underneath it all. We'll pay you back on Friday, Michael. I swear on your grandfather's life, she said, twisting the knife. Using his name was always her go-to move when she wanted to guarantee compliance. For 25 years, that would have been my cue. I would have scrambled for my wallet, my heart pounding with the desperate need to be the hero, to finally earn that crumb of approval. But the man she was talking to wasn't that boy anymore. Something inside me had been reforged in the fires of their cruelty. All right, I said, my voice deliberately even. Give me the website and the details. A palpable sigh of relief whispered through the phone. She thought she'd won. She rattled off the information, and I typed it into a blank document, not a payment portal. I'll take care of it, Mom, I said. The call ended. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the information on the screen. Then I closed the laptop, and I waited. 2 days passed. Then, on Thursday evening, the obnoxious roar of a high-performance engine shattered the peace of my quiet street. I looked out the window and saw a gleaming red sports car, the kind of car a midlife crisis was made of, pulling up to the curb. My brother Scott, the golden child, the future neurosurgeon, stepped out. He was wearing designer sunglasses and a smug grin that I knew better than my own reflection. A moment later, Charles, the other half of the match set, pulled up on a ridiculously expensive Italian sports bike, revving the engine just to make sure everyone was looking. They sauntered to my front door and leaned on the bell. I took a deep breath and opened it. Hey, big bro, Scott said, breezing past me into my apartment. Nice place, a little small but cozy. He surveyed my living room, his eyes lingering on the art I had framed on the walls, a silent judgment in his gaze. We came to return your card, Charles said, tossing a gold credit card onto my kitchen counter. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. Had to pick up some new toys to celebrate Scott's promotion. Hope you don't mind. Yeah, Scott added, picking up a small sculpture from my bookshelf and examining it with disdain before putting it down. We left you about $10 on it. Should be enough for a pizza. Or, a couple of those fancy coffees you artist types like. They both burst into laughter. It was the sound of my childhood, the soundtrack to every humiliation, a duet of derision. They stood there, radiating arrogance, waiting for me to crack. They expected me to yell, to demand an explanation, to show them how deeply they had wounded me. They fed on that reaction, but I didn't give it to them. I looked at the card on the counter. I looked at their stupid, expectant faces, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling bubbled up from my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was a pure, liberating amusement. I started to laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, deep, belly laugh that echoed through the apartment. Their smiles faltered. Confusion flickered in their eyes. This wasn't in their script. "What's so funny?" Charles asked, a new edge to his voice. I just shook my head, wiping a tear of laughter from my eye. The plan I had set in motion was working even better than I had imagined. They thought this was the punchline, their final victory. They had no idea it was just the setup. They laughed because they thought I had $10 left. I laughed because they were about to lose everything. To understand the profound satisfaction of that moment, you have to understand the 34 years of my life that led up to it. You have to understand what it feels like to be an afterthought in your own family portrait. My parents, Dr. Adam and Dr. Isabella James, were pillars of the community. They were brilliant, respected, and successful. They built a life that looked perfect from the outside. Inside, it was a different story. They had 3 sons, but their hearts only had room for 2. Scott and Charles, the twins, were their legacy. I was their obligation. The favoritism wasn't a secret. It was a house rule as fundamental as taking your shoes off at the door. It was woven into the fabric of every holiday, every family dinner, every birthday. My 12th birthday is burned into my memory with the clarity of a trauma. For weeks, I had been completely captivated by a magnificent wooden art set in the window of a downtown shop. It was a serious kit, with oil paints in a rainbow of colors, charcoal pencils of varying softness, and a fan of brushes that promised endless possibilities. It represented a world I desperately wanted to be a part of. I talked about it, I dreamed about it. I left the store's catalog open on the kitchen table, the page circled in red pen. On the morning of my birthday, I practically vibrated with anticipation. I ran downstairs to find my family assembled. There were 2 piles of gifts on the dining room table. A mountain of brightly wrapped boxes for the twins, whose birthdays were 6 months away, and a single, slim, rectangular gift for me. "Go on, Michael, open yours," my mother said, gesturing to the sad little box. My hands trembled as I tore off the paper. Inside was a high school-level advanced algebra workbook. "We noticed your math grades were slipping a bit," my father said, not looking up from the stock market report in the newspaper. "We thought you could use a head start. It's important to focus on practical skills, son." "Yeah, maybe one day you'll be smart enough to be a doctor. Like us," Scott quipped from behind his mountain of presents. He was already unwrapping a brand new video game console. Charles had a new pair of expensive basketball shoes. "Now, Scott, be nice," my mother said, but she was smiling. It was a joke they were all in on. I was the family project. The one who needed fixing. The one who wasn't quite right. I just stared at the equations in the workbook, my throat tight. I had to sit there and watch them get everything I wanted, and everything I didn't even know I could want. The cake was served, and their slices were, as always, a little bigger than mine. That day was a perfect metaphor for my youth. But the real schism, the moment the crack in our family turned into a canyon, happened when it was time to talk about the future. I was 17. We were at one of my mother's meticulously planned dinner parties, with important guests from the hospital. When one of the guests politely asked me what my college plans were, I knew it was a test. In front of this audience, I had to give the right answer. I took a deep breath and told the truth. "I'm going to major in art restoration." A fork clattered onto a plate. The polite chatter around the table faltered. My mother, Isabella, let out a sharp, brittle laugh that made my skin crawl. It was a sound designed to cut, to diminish. "Oh, Michael, you're still on about that?" she said, turning to the guests with an apologetic smile. "He's always been the artistic one." She said the word artistic like it was a diagnosis for a terminal illness. Then, she leaned forward, her voice becoming serious, confessional. It was a performance for the guests, a story to explain away her disappointing son. "You know," she began, "my own father was an artist, painter. He was a romantic who thought his passion was enough to live on. It wasn't." Her eyes grew dark with a memory I had never been privy to. I remember nights when there was no food in the cupboard. I remember him trying to pay the landlord with a canvas. That's not passion, that's selfishness. I worked my entire life to get away from that, to build something stable and respected. I will not have a son of mine romanticize that kind of failure. It was a devastatingly effective story. It painted me as a naive fool and her as a pragmatic survivor. It invalidated my entire being in front of a table of strangers. Scott, sensing his moment, jumped in. Why don't you do something that actually helps people, Mike? Like becoming a doctor? Why don't you make the family proud for once? The guests murmured in agreement. My father nodded, his expression a mixture of pride in Scott and disappointment in me. I felt my face burn with shame. My dreams weren't just dismissed. They were pathologized, treated as a symptom of some inherited weakness. The only person who ever saw my passion as a strength was my grandfather Joseph. He was my father's father, a retired engineer, a man of quiet dignity and immense warmth. He was everything my parents weren't. The night before I left for a state school, my parents refused to contribute a dime to a hobbyist's degree, so I was going on scholarships and soon loans. He pulled me aside on the porch. The air was cool, and the scent of jasmine from his garden was thick around us. Michael, he said, his voice low and kind. He pressed a thick, worn envelope into my hand. Don't you ever let them grind you down. What you have, that ability to see what's broken and make it beautiful again. That's a rare gift. It takes more patience and skill than they will ever understand. I'm so proud of you. I opened the envelope later in my car. Inside was $500 in crisp $20 bills. But it was his words that were the real treasure. They were my armor during the next 4 years. College was a blur of hard work. I had 2, sometimes 3 part-time jobs. I washed dishes in a greasy diner until 2 a.m., the smell of bleach and old food clinging to my clothes. I reshelved books in the silent, dusty stacks of the campus library. I ate ramen noodles and cheap sandwiches. Every dollar I made went toward tuition, rent, and my precious art supplies. I spent my nights hunched over a second-hand drafting table in my tiny apartment, practicing restoration techniques on discarded canvases I found at thrift stores. It was exhausting, lonely work, but it was mine. Meanwhile, my family life was a series of painful phone calls. I'd call home, wanting to share some small victory, a good grade on a paper, a compliment from a professor, and my mother would listen for 30 seconds before launching into a monologue about the twins. Scott just got accepted into a summer program at Johns Hopkins, she'd gush. And Charles, oh, you won't believe it, your father and I bought him a new car for his birthday. He was so surprised. I'd look around my cramped apartment, at my stack of unpaid bills, and listen to them talk about fraternity parties, spring break trips to Europe, and a life of effortless privilege. It was like we lived in 2 different universes. When I finally landed a prestigious internship at a small but respected museum, I thought, this is it. This is something they have to respect. I called home, my voice shaking with a pathetic, hopeful energy. Mom, Dad, I got the internship. It's at the Atherton Museum. It's a paid position. There was a pause. Oh, my mother said, her voice flat and unimpressed. The Atherton? That small place downtown? Well, I suppose that's nice for you, dear. A good little hobby to keep you busy. Then, without missing a beat. Anyway, have I told you that Scott's pre-med research paper was just published in a national journal? The dean of the medical school called your father personally to congratulate him. We're taking him to that Michelin-starred steakhouse this weekend to celebrate. My achievement wasn't just dismissed. It was instantly compared and found wanting. It was a nice little hobby, next to my brother's real, important success. I hung up the phone and just sat in silence, the joy draining out of me like water from a sieve. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for their approval. I was fighting against their definition of a successful life, a definition that had no room for me in it. After graduation, I received a job offer. A real job as a junior restorer at a museum in Los Angeles. The salary was modest, but the opportunity was immense. When I told my parents, my father sighed the sigh of a deeply burdened man. Los Angeles is so expensive, Michael. Are you sure you can manage on that salary? It just doesn't seem practical. They offered no help, no congratulations. Just doubt. Once again, Grandfather Joseph was my rock. He sent me a check large enough for my first month's rent and a security deposit in LA. His note was simple. Go build your life. Don't look back. I packed everything I owned into my sputtering old car and drove west, away from the suffocating expectations and the constant, casual cruelty. I was heading toward a new life, determined to build it on my own terms. I was naive enough to think that distance alone would be enough to protect me. Los Angeles was a baptism by fire. It was sprawling, expensive, and lonely, but it was also a place of immense opportunity, a city where you could reinvent yourself. My first apartment was a shoebox in a part of town that real estate agents generously called up and coming. It was loud, the walls were thin, but it was mine. It was the first space in my entire life that felt free from the weight of my family's judgment. The museum became my sanctuary. It was a smaller institution, which meant I got hands-on experience with incredible pieces of art far sooner than I would have at a larger museum. It was there that my world started to open up. I met Marcus, one of the night security guards. He was a big, quiet guy with a gentle soul who would often stay late just to watch me work. He'd bring me coffee and ask questions, not about how much money I made, but about the art itself. How do you know what colors they used back then? He'd ask, genuinely curious. He saw the skill, not the salary. He was the first friend I made in LA, the first person to make the city feel less like a concrete jungle and more like a community. It was Marcus who insisted I meet his cousin, Sophia. She's an art history professor, he told me. You guys would talk for hours. He was right. Sophia came to the museum, saw a 19th century landscape I had just finished restoring, and her eyes lit up with a professional, academic appreciation that was like water in the desert for me. She understood the chemistry, the history, the painstaking precision it required. She started recommending me for private commissions, small jobs at first, but they helped me build a reputation based purely on my talent. My life was slowly being populated by people who saw me for who I was, not for who my family wanted me to be. And then, at a small gallery opening Sophia had dragged me to, I met Eric. He was a graphic designer, standing in front of a bold, abstract piece, and he had the warmest smile I had ever seen. We started talking, and it felt like we had known each other for years. He was funny, smart, and passionate about his work. He told me about his family of accountants who couldn't understand why he wouldn't just get a stable job with the IRS. We bonded instantly over our shared status as creative black sheep. Falling in love with Eric was the most natural, easy thing I had ever done. He was my partner in every sense of the word. He celebrated my successes, no matter how small, and he held me up when the weight of my family history felt too heavy. He was the family I had chosen. After a year, I knew I had to face the music. I had to introduce him to my parents. We flew back for Thanksgiving, and I walked into my childhood home feeling like a soldier heading into battle. The evening was a masterclass in passive aggression. My parents cornered Eric, and what followed was less of a conversation and more of an interrogation disguised with polite smiles. Graphic design, my mother mused, swirling the wine in her glass. Is there much of a long-term future in that? Seems so. Dependent on trends. What's your 5-year plan, son? My father asked, his tone that of a CEO interviewing an intern. Do you have a 401k? A diverse portfolio? You have to think about these things. Scott and Charles stood by, smirking. So, you basically draw logos for a living? Scott asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Eric, bless his heart, handled it with more grace than they deserved. But I saw the tension in his jaw, the polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Later that night, as I was helping clear the table, my mother pulled me into the pantry, the door swinging shut behind us. Michael, she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. He seems like a nice enough boy, but really, you're a James. Your father and I have worked our entire lives to build a reputation. You could do so much better. The blood roared in my ears. Better? I hissed back, my voice shaking with a rage I could barely control. What does better mean to you, Mom? Tell me. Does it mean richer? Does it mean a more prestigious job? Does it mean someone you can brag about at your dinner parties? Because Eric is kind, and he's brilliant, and he loves me for who I am. That seems a hell of a lot better than anything you're offering. She just looked at me with cold, profound disappointment. You're so naive, she said, and walked out, leaving me alone in the dark with the smell of spices and my own fury. A year later, Eric asked me to marry him. On a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, he got down on one knee, and I said yes before he could even finish the question. It was the easiest, happiest decision of my life. We knew we couldn't afford a lavish wedding, but we wanted to celebrate with the people who truly loved us. As a formality, a final, foolish gesture of hope, I called my parents to ask if they would consider helping, even a little. The phone call was brief and brutal. A wedding? My father said, his voice flat. Michael, we're in the middle of funding Scott's final year of residency. That's our priority. If you've chosen to make this life for yourself, you need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. No congratulations. No questions about Eric. Just a cold, financial rejection. I hung up, but this time the ache was duller. Eric was there to wrap his arms around me. Their loss, he said. We'll make it beautiful. And we did. Grandfather Joseph sent us a generous check with a note that brought tears to my eyes. May your life together be as beautiful as the art you create. Our wedding was held in a community center that our friends transformed into a fairy tale grove. Marcus and his security guard buddies hung hundreds of fairy lights. Sophia arranged wildflowers in mason jars. It was a potluck of love and support. My old professor, Dr. Vasquez, even arranged for a student string quartet to play. It was perfect. It was us. My family arrived late, dressed as if for a funeral. My mother surveyed the room with a barely concealed sneer. I overheard her whisper to my father, "It looks like a barn raising." Scott and Charles spent the entire time in a corner, texting and laughing. They posed for one family photo, their smiles as fake as a $3 bill, and left before we even cut the cake. The next day, the true venom was revealed. My cousin Mark sent me a screenshot. It was from Scott's private social media page. He'd posted a photo of me and Eric, beaming, with the caption, "Survived the dollar store wedding. So brave of them to be poor in public. Hashtag DIY disaster." The comments were a bloodbath. "I thought I was at a homeless shelter's annual gala," Charles had written. Other relatives joined in. The worst part, the part that felt like a physical blow, was my parents' reaction. My mother had commented, "Boys, you are terrible," followed by 3 laughing crying emojis. My father had simply liked Scott's post. They weren't just bystanders. They were cheering from the sidelines. I showed the phone to Eric. He read it, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. "That's it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We're done. For real this time." The final break happened at a mandatory family reunion 5 months later. I was trying to avoid everyone, but I overheard Scott bragging about the graduation gift my parents were giving him for finishing his residency. A month-long, first-class trip to Italy. "Yeah, Mom and Dad are covering everything," he said loudly. "They said I've worked hard and I deserve it." Something inside me, a dam that had been cracking for years, finally burst. I turned around. "Must be nice," I said, my voice carrying across the perfectly manicured lawn. "To have your entire life subsidized by Mom and Dad." The silence was instant. Scott's face flushed. "What's your problem, Michael?" "My problem?" I laughed, a raw, angry sound. "My problem is that I had to pay for my own dollar store wedding while you're flying first class to Rome. My problem is that I worked 3 jobs to get through college while you were getting a new car for your birthday. My problem is that you are a spoiled, entitled brat who has never had to work for a single thing in his life, and you have the audacity to mock me for it." The fight was ugly, public, and cathartic. It was years of resentment pouring out of me. It ended only when Grandfather Joseph stood up, his voice shaking with age but ringing with authority. "Enough!" he commanded, looking at my parents with utter contempt. I have watched you nurture this cruelty. I am ashamed to call you my family. He walked over to me, took my arm and said, "Let's go, Michael." As we left, I pulled out my phone. I went to my contacts. I blocked Isabella. I blocked Adam. I blocked Scott. I blocked Charles. With each tap of the screen, I felt a painful, liberating lightness. As I sat in the car next to my grandfather with Eric in the back, I knew this was the end of something. I looked at Eric and said, my voice hoarse, I was a fool to keep waiting for them to change. From now on, I build my own world. The silence that followed was profound. For the first few weeks after cutting them off, I felt like an astronaut who had untethered himself from the mothership. There was a terrifying freedom in it, but also a deep, echoing loneliness. That void, however, didn't last. It was quickly filled by peace, by focus, and by the steady, unwavering presence of Eric. Freed from the constant psychic drain of my family's drama, our lives began to flourish in ways we had only dreamed of. Eric's graphic design business exploded. He landed a massive contract with a new tech company, and suddenly our tiny second bedroom, which served as his office, was buzzing with creative energy. Seeing him so confident and fulfilled was infectious. It made me believe that a different kind of life was possible. My own career began to shift as well. The private commissions that had trickled in were now a steady stream. An elderly client, a sharp-witted woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, whose late husband's portrait I had restored, became my biggest champion. She introduced me to her circle of friends, a group of serious, wealthy art collectors. Suddenly, I wasn't just restoring faded family heirlooms. I was being entrusted with museum-quality pieces, works by artists I had studied in college. The work was demanding and required absolute concentration, but it was deeply rewarding. My income didn't just grow, it multiplied. We finally moved out of our cramped apartment and into a beautiful loft with soaring ceilings and huge windows that flooded the space with that famous California light. I had a real studio. Eric had a real office. We were building a life brick by brick, a life that was ours. It was amidst this newfound success that I began to notice my grandfather slowing down. He was approaching 90, and while his mind was as keen as a razor, his body was growing frail. He became more forgetful about small things, and one day he called me in a state of mild panic. He couldn't find the deed to his house, and he was worried. "Michael," he said, his voice thin over the phone, "I have decades of paperwork, and it's all a jumble. I don't know where anything is. Could you help an old man sort through his life?" I started spending my weekends at his house, a place filled with the warm, familiar smells of old books and his pipe tobacco. We sat together at his large oak desk, and I began the painstaking process of sorting through boxes of documents. It was a task perfectly suited to my skills, patience, attention to detail, and the ability to find order in chaos. For the most part, it was standard life admin. Old tax returns, car titles, insurance policies. But then, in the bottom of a dusty filing cabinet, I found a simple manila folder. The tab, labeled in my grandfather's shaky cursive, read, "Loans, Family." A cold premonition washed over me. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a history of betrayal meticulously, if unknowingly, recorded. There were handwritten ledgers dating back to when I was in high school. Page after page detailed thousands of dollars my parents had borrowed. The entries were heartbreakingly specific. $10,000, down payment assistance on the new house. $15,000 Scott and Charles's tuition. $5,000 new car for Adam. Next to these columns of withdrawals was a column for repayments. It was almost entirely blank. But it got worse. As I dug deeper, I started cross-referencing the ledgers with his actual bank statements. I found things he hadn't even recorded. Cash advances from his credit cards, always for round, significant amounts, always made just a few days after my mother had mentioned some unexpected expense on the phone. There were checks written to my father's medical practice, labeled investment, that had never paid a single dividend. It wasn't just borrowing. It was a systematic, 2-decade-long campaign of financial exploitation. They had been bleeding him dry, using his love and generosity as a cover for their own greed and fiscal irresponsibility. The anger that rose in me was cold and pure. This wasn't about me being the unfavored son anymore. This was about them preying on a vulnerable old man, their own father. That night, I brought the folder home. I spread the papers out on our dining room table. Eric sat next to me, reading through them in silence. His face, usually so open and warm, hardened into a mask of disbelief and disgust. "My God, Michael," he whispered, looking up at me. "This is a pattern. This is calculated. This is theft." "I know," I said, my voice hoarse. For a moment, the old helplessness washed over me. "I don't know what to do." Eric reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm. "Yes, you do," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "The old Michael, the one who took their abuse, wouldn't have known what to do. But you're not him anymore. We don't get angry and yell. We get smart. We get professional help. We build a case." The next day, on the recommendation of our friend Sophia, we made an appointment with a man named David Chun. He was a forensic accountant, a financial advisor who specialized in untangling exactly these kinds of toxic family financial webs. We sat in his stark, modern office, the evidence spread between us. I told him everything, from the math workbook on my 12th birthday to the dollar store wedding. He listened intently, his face impassive. Then he spent a solid hour poring over the documents, his calculator clicking softly, his pen making notes in the margins. Finally, he leaned back, took off his glasses, and polished them with a cloth. "Mr. James," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your assessment is correct. This is a clear, long-term pattern of financial exploitation. But there's more." He turned his computer screen toward us. "I ran a public records check on your parents and your brothers. They are leveraged to the hilt. Second mortgages, massive car loans, maxed out lines of credit. They're living a lifestyle they cannot afford, and it looks like your grandfather's accounts were what they were using to stay afloat. From what I can see here, their financial house of cards is about to collapse." The air left my lungs. It wasn't just greed. It was desperation. They were cornered. And cornered animals are the most dangerous. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the prey. I had the truth. I had the evidence. And I had a plan. The knowledge David Chin gave us was a weapon. It transformed my anger from a hot, messy emotion into something cold, sharp, and precise. The objective was no longer just to protect my grandfather. It was to architect a final, undeniable reckoning. I sat with grandfather Joseph in his sun-drenched living room and laid out everything David had uncovered. I watched his face as the full scope of his children's betrayal settled in. The sadness in his eyes was profound, but beneath it, a long-dormant steeliness emerged. He had been an engineer, a man who believed in logic, in cause and effect. He understood that actions must have consequences. "I knew they were careless with money," he said, his voice thin but steady. "I never imagined they were vultures picking me clean." "What do we do, Michael?" "We don't just defend," I said, my voice filled with a newfound certainty. "We set a trap they will walk into willingly, led by their own arrogance and greed." The three of us, me, Eric, and my grandfather, became a council of war. We spent hours planning. The goal was to create a situation so unambiguous, so damning, that they could never twist the narrative, never again play the victims. We decided to call one last family meeting. Not a casual get-together, but an official summit, framed as a discussion about the future of the estate. It was bait we knew they couldn't ignore. The invitation was sent. They agreed immediately. They arrived at my grandfather's house the following Sunday, a united front of entitlement. Isabella was dressed in a crisp cream pantsuit, Adam in a golf club blazer. They walked in as if they were assessing property they already owned. Scott and Charles followed, exuding a potent mixture of boredom and impatience. The tension during dinner was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The small talk was excruciating. My mother kept circling the topic of my grandfather's health, her voice slick with false sympathy. "Dad, you look tired," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "We're really worried about you being in this big house all by yourself. Maybe it's time we explored some nicer, more manageable living arrangements for you." "I'm quite comfortable where I am, Isabella," my grandfather replied, his voice cool. After the plates were cleared, we moved to the living room. Showtime. I casually placed my phone on the corner of the coffee table, partially obscured by a book of photography. The red light of the recording app was a tiny secret eye. My grandfather, playing his part to perfection, began. He sighed heavily. "I've asked you all here because I've been reviewing my finances with Michael's help," he said, his voice imbued with the frailty of a concerned old man. "And frankly, we've found some things that are very troubling." The shift in the room was electric. Adam sat up straighter. Isabella's polite smile vanished, replaced by a thin, hard line. "Troubling how, Dad?" Adam asked, his voice cautious. I was the one who answered. I kept my voice level academic. "Troubling in the form of 20 years of undocumented, unrepaid loans, totaling over $200,000. I said. I slid a neatly printed summary from David Chun across the polished wood of the table. "Troubling in the form of credit card statements showing charges for luxury goods you bought on his accounts. The legal term for it, I believe, is elder financial abuse." The word abuse detonated in the center of the room. "How dare you?" Isabella shrieked, her voice rising. "We are his family. We were supporting him, caring for him. This is slander." "You're just jealous," Scott sneered, his face turning a blotchy red. "You were never part of the inner circle, so now you're trying to poison him against us. He wanted to help us. We're his successful sons, not his charity case artist's son." The venom they spat was more potent than I could have imagined. They weren't just defensive. They were aggressive, convinced of their own righteousness. The argument escalated, a cacophony of greed and entitlement. They attacked my career, my marriage to Eric, my entire life. And then Charles, in a fit of pure, unfiltered rage, turned on his grandfather. He stood over the old man, his finger pointing. "You're a senile old fool, and he's brainwashed you. Fine. Keep your precious money. You know what? I can't wait for you to die so we can sell this dump of a house and finally get what's coming to us." A breathtaking, horrified silence descended upon the room. The words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. They hung in the air, shimmering with their own ugliness. My mother didn't gasp. My father didn't reprimand him. Their silence was their consent. They felt it, too. My grandfather didn't have to feign his reaction. The devastation on his face was real and profound. A lifetime of love and support, repaid with this. He looked at his son, his daughter-in-law, his grandsons, and saw nothing but predators. He visibly shrank in his chair, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, leaning heavily on his cane. His voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper. "Get out." "Dad, he didn't mean—" My mother started. "Get out!" he roared. A sudden, shocking burst of strength. "All of you, get out of my house. Now." They scurried out like insects exposed when a rock is overturned, muttering curses and threats. The slam of the front door echoed like a gunshot. In the ringing silence, the three of us remained. My grandfather sank back into his armchair, his face pale and slick with a sweat of pure emotional exhaustion. Eric went to him, kneeling by his side and placing a comforting hand on his knee. I walked to the coffee table. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. I looked at the digital file, a perfect, high-fidelity capture of their souls. I had it. I met Eric's gaze across the room. He gave me a slow, grim nod. The trap had been sprung. The evidence was secure. Now it was time to build the cage. I went to my grandfather's side. "It's almost over, Grandpa," I said softly. "I promise." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a terrible sadness, but also with a glimmer of trust. He was entrusting his justice to me. It was a burden I was finally strong enough to carry. The days that followed were executed with the precision of a military operation. The anger and grief were channeled into cold, hard action. Our first stop was the office of Ms. Albright, my grandfather's lawyer. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. We didn't just present her with a story of family drama. We presented her with a case. David Chun walked her through the financial analysis, a clear and damning timeline of exploitation. Then, I placed my phone on her large mahogany desk. Before we discuss the will, I said, I think you should hear this. I played the recording. Ms. Albright listened without expression, but I saw a muscle twitch in her jaw when Charles delivered his final, hateful line. When it was over, she was silent for a long moment. Well, she said finally, her voice devoid of emotion, that certainly simplifies things. She looked at my grandfather. Joseph, we not only have grounds to completely rewrite your will and trust, we have enough here to file a police report and petition for a restraining order. No police, my grandfather said, his voice firm. The engineer in him wanted order, not chaos. I want to disconnect from them. Cleanly. Permanently. I want to protect Michael, and I want to build something good from this wreckage. The new estate plan was drafted that day. It was an ironclad document. The house, the investments, the savings, everything my parents had mentally spent a dozen times over, was transferred into a trust with me as the sole beneficiary and executor. And at my insistence, a significant portion was earmarked for the establishment of the Joseph James Art Scholarship. We were turning the money they had worshipped into a legacy of creativity and opportunity. When my grandfather signed the documents, his hand was surprisingly firm. It was the signature of a man reclaiming his life. With the legal fortress built, it was time to move on to the final, most delicate phase of the plan, the strike. I knew from David's analysis that my family was financially on the brink. They were desperate, and I was going to use that desperation as the mechanism of the trap. I waited a full week, letting them stew in their anger and uncertainty. Then I chose my moment. It was a Wednesday evening. I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice a whip crack. What do you want, Michael? I took a breath and summoned the ghost of my former self, the hesitant, eager to please son. My voice cracked slightly as I spoke. Mom, hi. I know you're angry, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. I paused, letting the fake guilt hang in the air. Maybe I was too hard on you all. I hate that things are like this. I was talking to one of Dad's old colleagues, and he mentioned the clinic was having trouble with that big payment for the new MRI machine. This was a calculated risk, a piece of information I'd gleaned from David Chen's research. It was their biggest, most immediate financial pressure point. There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear the rapid calculation happening in her mind. Her pride was at war with her panic. Panic won. It's been a nightmare, she conceded, her voice losing its edge and taking on a weary, confidential tone. The bank has been completely unreasonable. We're facing penalties if it's not paid by the end of the week. This was my opening. I want to help, I said, my voice soft. I can't just give you money, but I could pay the bill directly to the supplier, from my account, as a peace offering, to show you that I still care about this family. The bait was irresistible. A $5,000 problem solved, and it would come from the son she had scorned, confirming, in her twisted mind, her ultimate power over me. Oh, Michael, she breathed, her voice now dripping with saccharine sweetness. That's incredibly generous of you. Are you sure? I'm sure, I said. I'm on the supplier's website now. It has a third-party payment option. To make sure it's secure and I don't keep any of your details, why don't you just read me your credit card information? I'll type it in directly, make the payment, and then I won't have it saved anywhere. It was a beautiful lie, wrapped in the language of security and helpfulness. I wasn't on a payment portal. I had a blank text document open on my laptop, the cursor blinking patiently. Without a moment's hesitation, Isabella, the brilliant doctor, the master manipulator, fell for it completely. She grabbed her purse and read the numbers aloud. Isabella M. James. For 228. I typed every digit. The card number, the expiration date, the 3-digit security code from the back. Okay, got it, I said when she was finished. It's processing now. It says, payment successful. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, a thrill of victory so pure it was almost dizzying. I hope this helps, Mom. Thank you, son, she said, the words dripping with triumph. She thought she had just played me like a fiddle. I hung up the phone and stared at the string of numbers on my screen. It was more than a credit card number. It was the key to their self-destruction. The next morning, I composed a carefully worded email. The subject line was "so stressed." I sent it to both Scott and Charles. The body of the email was a work of art. Hey guys, don't tell Mom and Dad I'm telling you this, but I'm kind of freaking out. I had to pay that huge bill for the clinic for them yesterday. Used my own credit card and it pretty much wiped me out. I was trying to save the payment confirmation for my records and I think I accidentally saved the card info into this text file on my desktop. I'm so tired and stressed I can't even see straight. Anyway, just needed to vent to someone who would get it. This is a mess. I attached the simple text document. It was named payment_confirmation _ details, TXT. Inside was the key to the kingdom, our mother's credit card information. I hit send. The trap was laid, baited, and armed. All I had to do now was wait for the vipers to strike. The 2 days that followed were a masterclass in controlled patience. On the outside, I was calm. I went to my studio, worked on a delicate restoration project that required a steady hand, and had dinner with Eric. But on the inside, I was a tightly coiled spring. Every notification on my phone made my heart leap. Their arrogance is the one constant you can rely on, Eric reminded me as we sat on the couch one evening. The idea of you having something they can take, especially something you complained about having to spend, it's irresistible to them. They won't just use it. They'll use it to punish you. He was, as always, right. The first confirmation came via text on the 3rd day. It was from my friend Marcus. He sent a photo of a brilliant red sports car, so knew it still had the temporary dealer plates. Your brother Scott is holding court in the doctor's parking lot with this new beast, the text read, telling everyone he got a massive bonus. Must be nice. I looked at the picture, at the smug reflection of my brother in the polished chrome. The first domino had fallen. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Aunt Nicole. Michael, honey, are you sitting down? I was just on the freeway, and I swear I saw your brother Charles weave past me on a motorcycle that looked like it belonged in a James Bond movie. He was laughing like a maniac. Is everything okay? I'm worried. Everything is under control. Aunt Nicole? I said, my voice calm. Thank you for letting me know. They had both taken the bait. And not just for a small purchase. They had gone big. They had acted out of pure, spiteful, competitive greed, each wanting to outdo the other in flaunting their newfound wealth. They were so consumed with the idea of sticking it to me that they hadn't stopped to think for a single second. That evening I was prepared. I knew they would come. It was part of their pathology. They couldn't just take from me. They had to rub my face in it. The doorbell rang at precisely 7:30 p.m. I looked through the peephole. It was both of them, dressed up, beaming with a sickening, triumphant energy. I took a deep, centering breath and opened the door. Well, Scott said, sweeping into my apartment with an air of theatrical grandeur. Look at the struggling artist in his natural habitat. We heard you were a little cash-strapped, Charles added, a cruel sneer playing on his lips. So we thought we'd stop by, see how the other half lives. I'm managing, I said, my voice quiet. I closed the door, sealing us in. Eric stood silently by the kitchen entrance, his arms crossed. He was my witness, my anchor. Oh, I'm sure, Scott chuckled. He reached into his pocket and, with a flourish, tossed a gold credit card onto my coffee table. It was an exact replica of my own. We went on a bit of a shopping spree, to stimulate the economy. Don't worry, we left you about $10. Should cover a bus ticket. They erupted in loud, braying laughter. They were so proud of their own cleverness, so certain of their victory. They waited for my reaction, hungry for my anger, my despair. I let them have their moment. I let their laughter fill the room and then die out into an expectant silence. I looked at them, not with the hurt of a victim, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. You know, I said, my voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room, I honestly don't care what you bought or what card you used. The smiles on their faces tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Scott asked, his bravado wavering for the first time. But, I continued, reaching for my phone on the mantelpiece. Before you go, I think there's something you should hear. I tapped the screen. The sound that filled the room was not music. It was the sound of their own voices, captured in high fidelity, dripping with venom. It was the sound of them in my grandfather's living room. I watched their faces transform as they heard themselves. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickly horror. I saw Scott's face go pale. I saw Charles's eyes widen as his own voice, clear as a bell, echoed through my apartment. I can't wait for you to die so we can sell this dump and finally get what's coming to us. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing. They were exposed, stripped bare, their ugliness laid out for them to see. And as for the credit card, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, cold and sharp as a scalpel. You're right. I did send you the information in that file, but I made a little typo in my email. It wasn't my card. I let the sentence hang in the air, a drop of poison waiting to be absorbed. It was Mom's. You just spent a combined $75,000 on a car and a motorcycle using your parents' own credit card. The one that was already on the verge of being maxed out. The one that is tied to the second mortgage on their house. Good luck explaining that. As if summoned by a dark magic, Scott's phone began to vibrate violently on the coffee table, its buzzing a frantic, angry scream. The screen lit up, MOM calling. Before he could even react, Charles's phone started its own frantic dance. Dad calling. They stared at their phones as if they were live grenades. They looked at me, their faces a grotesque mask of panic, confusion, and dawning comprehension. They had been so blinded by their hate for me that they had committed financial suicide. Get out, I said, my voice flat and final. They stumbled backwards, fumbling for their phones, for the door, for an escape from the trap they had so eagerly sprung on themselves. As they scrambled out into the hallway, I heard Scott answer his phone, his voice a high-pitched squeak. Mom, wait. There's been a huge mistake. I closed the door, shutting out their pathetic pleas. I walked over to my phone, navigated to their names in my contact list. Adam, Isabella, Scott, Charles, and for the last time I pressed delete. It wasn't an act of anger anymore. It was an act of sanitation. Eric came and wrapped his arms around me. I leaned back against his chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt the absence of their weight. I was free. 2 years have passed. The fallout from that night was, from what I've heard, apocalyptic. The credit card company launched a fraud investigation which, of course, led right back to them. The debt was too massive to hide. My father was forced into a deeply embarrassing early retirement, his reputation in tatters. They sold their big, beautiful house, the one they were so proud of, to cover the debts. Aunt Nicole told me they now live in a small condominium complex out by the freeway, the kind of place they would have driven by with pity and disgust. We have not spoken a single word since that night, and I feel nothing about that but relief. My grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep about a year ago. It was a profound loss, but the final year and a half of his life were filled with a peace he hadn't known for decades. He was free from the constant stress and disappointment. Best of all, he got to see the launch of the foundation we established in his name before he died. He held the first scholarship certificate in his hands, his eyes shining with pride. His legacy wasn't going to be a house or a stock portfolio. It was going to be the vibrant, creative futures of young artists who, like me, had been told their dreams were worthless. Tonight, Eric and I are hosting the second annual fundraiser for the Joseph James Art Scholarship. Our loft, The home we built together is filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and passionate conversations about art. Our family is here, our real family. Marcus is joking with Sophia by the food table. Aunt Nicole is catching up with Dr. Vasquez. Mrs. Rodriguez is holding court, telling a rapt audience about her latest art acquisition. David Chun is even here, looking surprisingly relaxed in a sweater instead of a suit. These are the people who saw me when I was invisible. I step away from the crowd for a moment and walk over to the small gallery space we've set up to display the scholarship recipients' work. One of the students, a young painter named Maria with paint stains on her fingers and a fire in her eyes, comes over to me. She's standing in front of her canvas, a bold, emotional landscape that practically vibrates with energy. I almost quit 100 times, she confesses, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents, they don't get it. They're good people, but they kept telling me to be practical, to get a real job, that I was wasting my life. I look at her fierce talent and her fragile hope, and I see myself 20 years ago. But I also see the difference. She has support. She has a community. She has a chance. I put a hand on her shoulder, and my voice is steady and sure. Don't you ever let anyone tell you your passion is worthless. I say, the words coming from the deepest part of my soul. Its value isn't something other people can decide. It's in the work. It's in the patience, the skill, the hundreds of hours you spend alone making something beautiful out of nothing. It's in your ability to see the world differently, to find the light and the color that others miss, and to show it to them. That's not just a skill. That's a superpower. She looks from my eyes to her painting, and for the first time, she seems to see it not just as a piece of art, but as a testament to her own strength. She smiles, a real, radiant smile. I look around the room, at the art on the walls, at the faces of the people I love, at the man standing next to me who is my entire world. For so long, my life was defined by what was taken from me. Now it's defined by what I have built. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever had to find the strength to walk away from a toxic situation to build a better life for yourself? Share your story in the comments below. It's important we know we're not alone. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because my story is proof that the best chapters often begin after the most difficult ones end.